I'm pleased to introduce my colleague, Joe Dabrowski, Head of Defined Benefit, Local Government Pension Scheme, and Standards at the PLSA. Welcome, Joe.
Hi, Rachel. Thank you very much. Delighted to be able to co-host this session on cost transparency with you. I feel like my Eurovision dreams have come true, but great to be able to discuss this topic. One of our key priority issues and areas of focus at the PLSA. I'm going to run through quickly to our panelists shortly, but we'll have time for questions, so feel free to fire those through as we go. I also just wanted to kind of mention that one of the key things that we do here at the PLSA is we look after the sort of day-to-day running of the CTI and some of the future development work alongside our partner organisations and getting industry feedback. So the more feedback you can give us, all the better. But without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Mel, Chair of the CTI Board.
Thank you very much, Joe. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very pleased you've joined us. Hopefully the slides are now appearing in front of you. I've been the chair of the CTI board since early 2019 when we first launched. I'm going to give a short introduction to the CTI framework before handing over to two of my fellow board members. So Jenny Condron, who'll be talking from a consultancy perspective about how to make CTI work for your clients, and Jeff Houston, who'll be sharing the LGPS perspective, including how this fits with the Scheme Advisory Board's existing transparency code. And after that, as my colleagues have said, we'll have a chance for detailed discussion about the framework and answering any questions. So just moving on to the second slide, CTI is the new industry standard for institutional investment cost data. It's important to know that this is very much a industry-led initiative. The framework has been designed over a detailed process of several years. It's involved a huge amount of collaboration with input from different parts of the industry, be it asset owners, managers, intermediaries. It evolved initially in response to recommendations from the FCA's Asset Management Market Study and the Institutional Disclosure Working Group led by Chris Sear, and sprung out of that, put recommendations to the FCA. And as we'll hear from Jeff, this has been very much championed by the LGPS, who've been first movers in their adoption of the Transparency Code. Moving to the next slide, what are we here to do as the CTI board? We've got three core objectives: to promote understanding, to raise awareness, and to encourage full transparency and standardisation of costs and charges information for institutional investors. Our expectation is that this framework will become the standard format for reporting costs and charges, and that's across both DB and DC pension schemes, and for both the private sector schemes and the LGPS. This should mean that cost data can be compared accurately and consistently across a range of different asset classes, across different asset managers, and will support a better understanding of overall value for money, of course, when considered alongside investment performance. This isn't just about driving down costs. It should make life easier for both asset managers and asset owners. So asset owners will know what they or their advisors should be asking for, and asset managers in turn will know what they can expect their clients to request of them, and they can prepare and standardise their own systems and processes. So in that sense, it very much encourages consistency and it will drive transparency. Next, who is the CTI supported by? So on to the next slide, thank you. So the PLSA and the IA and the LGPS Scheme Advisory Board are the partnership that is the foundation of the CTI. So PLSA provides the secretariat, but very much a collaborative cross-industry effort here. This framework is overseen by the CTI board. That's got broad representation across the industry. We also have the BVCA directly represented on the board, and representatives from a number of asset owners and asset managers. And while CTI isn't a regulatory requirement, TPR and the FCA both sit as advisors on the board alongside DWP and TUC, and they all have observer status there. It's worth noting that DWP, including government ministers, and the FCA and TPR have been very supportive of CTI, and also very clear about their expectations for the industry in adopting the CTI templates. Moving to the next slide, we've been guided by a number of principles in developing the CTI framework. So fundamentally, this is about standardization. We need standard cost reporting to enable effective comparison and transparency. We've also sought to make the CTI tools as flexible and user-friendly as possible. So something the Investment Association were particularly keen to do was make sure we had machine-readable formats ready, as well as Excel templates. And we also provide examples and templates to help support how to summarise that data effectively. I'd also like to stress that the CTI framework is completely free to use and open source. We do obviously retain version control because we only want one version of the template circulating at any point in time, but anyone can access them. Onto the next slide. So that is open access via the website. Any different players in the market can get hold of these, whether it's your in-house teams, your consultants, or your data providers. We're keen that the CTI's expectations have been sensitive to other commercial and regulatory pressures. So in particular, the framework can be aligned with your own schemes and your reporting cycles. It's not a fixed date and time. You have to do this. We've set an expectation. You'll do that for the end of your December or the end of your March reporting year ends. And similarly, while the CTI framework is very much voluntary and industry led, we've taken care to ensure it's as compatible as possible with existing regulatory requirements. So MiFID in particular, but we're also now helpfully collaborating with the ABI on alignment with the DCPT. Next slide. So for those who haven't had a chance yet to look at the materials on the CTI website, at the heart of this are the tools, the downloadable templates that managers can use. And when we looked at this back in May last year, following the pilots, we felt that 3 of the templates were ready to launch. That's the user summary, the main account template, which covers the majority of asset classes, and the private equity template. And we launched those templates last May. We keep them under continuous review, and we're also developing additional bespoke tools according to demand. So one clear example there is an LDI reporting template we've been developing. We expect that to launch very soon, and there's a number of priority areas in the pipeline that the board is considering. One of the things I think we've been most pleased with to date is just the sheer number of downloads that we've seen from the templates on the website, along with some of the feedback from the utility providers that I think we'll hear from later on the number of approaches that they've had for support, either from schemes or their advisors, since the templates were launched. And then moving on to look at guidance. So there's a lot of supporting material on the CTI website. That again is a free resource, and it's regularly reviewed and updated. So there's top tips and how-to guides on there for investors and advisors. A lot of specific FAQs about how to use the framework, including response to some of the specific asset classes, some of the technical inquiries that we've been receiving. And over the course of the year, of course, the 3 partner organisations have also fielded a lot of queries about the framework. That's certainly something that we found a helpful resource at USS to be able to contact the PLSA, for example, directly, or get involved in some of the specific groups there. So do get in touch with PLSA via the contact details on the CTI website if they can help. So my final slide is just a nudge to the CTI website page. Please do have a browse on there as we're on the webinar, if you haven't already, and think about any questions you'd like to raise. Thank you again for your time watching this seminar and your interest in the CTI more broadly. I'm now going to pass over to Jenny, who'll be talking in a bit more detail about how the framework can be used in practice.
Thanks, Mel. Right, manage technology, hopefully. So I'm Jenny Condron. I'm a CTI board member and chair of the Association of Consulting Actuaries. And I'm going to give you a brief overview of the CTI framework from a consultant's perspective and cover some of the important issues to bear in mind and what to focus on with your clients going forward. I'll also share a couple of examples from schemes which are already using the CTI framework. So first, how should consultants work with the CTI framework? In our role as intermediaries between asset managers and our clients, scheme trustees, we can play an important role in advising what the CTI framework provides, so powerful tools for reporting and summarising cost information for the assets that they own. How to use CTI most effectively to help them fulfil their governance responsibilities, and how to read and potentially act on the information in the templates. Information providers or utilities also offer a number of services which integrate with the CTI framework. And as Mel said, some are joining us to answer your questions later in the webinar. Of course, investment costs form only one part of any value for money assessment. This will likely encompass performance and service elements too. Consultants can help to ensure that trustees have clear summaries of headline costs. The CTI website includes an illustration of how to do this in the user summary template, which you can download from there. Trustees should then be encouraged to consider the more detailed information available to help benchmark similar investments across their portfolio or indeed in selection exercises. And of course, costs need to be considered within the broader context of the total costs of operation. As well as asset management fees, these include pension management and administration costs, as well as other investment management costs too, including investment administration, cost of risk reporting and custodians, and of course, consultancy costs. I suspect that there are very few asset owners or indeed consultants who could today identify all of these elements for the assets that they oversee. It's helpful to reflect on a couple of examples of schemes which are already using the CTI framework to good effect. In 2011, RPMI Railpen undertook an investment transformation programme with a focus on value for members. They commented that at that time, there was no industry-wide mechanism for gathering the cost information needed, and so had to create their own approach, drawing together details about costs from various different sources and documents. Not surprisingly, it was hugely difficult to compile that data across a range of managers in a consistent and meaningful way. It also took a huge amount of time, partly because so many other schemes were also asking investment managers for similar but subtly different types of information. At the end, Ellie, I have lost broadband. If you can move on the slide, please. At the end of 2011, RPMI Railpen believed its costs were 80 million per year. However, after introducing the CTI framework in 2019, RPMI Railpen found there was an additional £210 million worth of costs. As a result of analysing and actioning this, they believe they have been able to make at least a percentage saving in costs. Next slide, please, Ellie. It's an enormous saving that they have been able to achieve. Next slide. We've also heard from the RBS Group Pension Fund that introducing the CTI framework has significantly reduced the time it takes to gather cost information from all of their asset managers. Next slide, please. RBS is also benefiting from the standardisation which CTI brings when benchmarking against other schemes. Next slide, please. Robert Ward's comments here are so true, especially in current times. Next slide. So, what are the next steps for us as consultants? First, if you haven't already, review the CTI website. Here you can find tools, templates, and guidance together with FAQs to help you. Second, make sure you engage early with your clients, understand how they assess value for money at present, and how you can help them to ensure the CTI framework is integrated with that in the most effective way. And finally, ask your client's permission to request completed templates for their asset managers and then discuss these with them. This will help you understand your client's needs and the full detail of the costs they are exposed to. I'll now hand over to Jeff, who's going to talk about the LGPS perspective and how CTI is integrated into the Transparency Code. Jeff.
Thanks, Jenny. Hopefully I have gained control of these slides. Yes, I have. Well, that's bits worked. Having just got to say, as someone who is quite experienced in doing public speaking, this is the weirdest thing I have ever done in my life. It's sort of like standing on a stage with your back to the audience while looking at only your slides. That's what it feels like at this point in time. So that's why we're all probably a little bit more stilted than you would normally hear us. But let's have a go anyway, and let's go through this. This is talking about the LGPS, the Code of Transparency, that we've been going now for a few years, and how that fits in with the CTI and how we're going to take that forward, especially in terms of what we're doing on a compliance and reporting system. So first of all, just a little bit of background to the code itself. Just a reminder that it's entirely voluntary. Managers sign up to it at their own volition, although quite a lot of LGPS funds and pools now use this as part of their procurement process, so maybe not so voluntary as it started out. Started with listed assets only, and it required submission of template data without request from the asset owner. That was an important thing about it. It wasn't a situation where the asset owner had to make the request before it came through. We put in there about 12 months of best efforts because we recognised that this was voluntary. This was about cooperation between asset owners and asset managers, and also about respecting that data and respecting who that data belonged to. So there was something in the code about no passing on that data without the permission of the manager. Although it was listed, we said if you wanted to sign up for alternative assets in advance, managers could do, and we did have a couple who did that. And we always had it in our minds to put something in there about compliance. It's all very well putting a code out there, but let's see who's doing it, let's see who's complying with it. So moving on from there, progress against the code. We've now got 137 managers signed up to the code, and that covers about 196 billion in LGPS assets. That was 196 billion when these slides are done. Who knows how much that is now. We've also brought Scottish funds in as part of the code, and we've had this switch over now between the LGPS and IA templates. And although they call there the LGPS IA templates, must give a big thank you to Chris here, who was instrumental in putting those templates together for us. The CTI templates have been available since June 2019, but we did give 12 months handover so that people could move from the LGPS IA templates to the CTI templates. And the first private market managers have now come along because the CTI templates include private equity, and we've now got a number of private market managers signed up to the code as well. So the compliance and reporting system, just going back, this is something that said we always wanted to do. We did a procurement process for that last year, and we appointed Beheras. I think it's important that we say that this is being built for us by Beheras, and it's based on their existing technology, but it's an entirely separate bespoke system, and all of the data is held entirely separately from any of their current data. The primary purpose of the system is compliance. So it's about the Scheme Advisory Board being able to see who's sending those templates in on time and who's not. So it'll be interesting to see how that goes. And it does contain some reporting facilities, but it was never designed to be a benchmarking tool. This is not the Scheme Advisory Board trying to be a benchmarking provider. It's not for that at all. It's being built and it's being tested during late 2019 and early 2020. and it went live on the 1st of April 2020. And yes, it went live before 12 o'clock, so it did count as an April Fool for those who thought it was. We've now got managers who are putting themselves on the system, and then they are creating the mandates and the relationships needed to submit those templates as they go through. And then there is the facility for the LGPS funds when they exit from their side of the system, not only to see some reporting functionality, but also to bring in third parties with managers' consent. So if they want to bring in their consultant to help them to analyse their data, they can do. If they want to bring in another third party provider to grab that data and then benchmark it with somebody else, they can do, as I said, provided they get the manager's consent to actually do that. And then finally, just a couple of screenshots from the system just to prove it's real. That first screenshot there shows the Scheme Advisory Board's view, which basically just shows all of the mandates and as they're coming in, and we can see it by manager or LGPS fund, which mandates are late, which mandates are on time, which mandates are still out there to be expected. And then the other screen shows the kind of breakdown that can be seen by an LGPS fund, because it can see a breakdown of its own costs, and it can see a comparison with the LGPS universe on an average basis. And one of the things I just need to stress, because people keep asking me all the time, what could Scheme Advisory Board see? Scheme Advisory Board can only see aggregate data. We can't see individual mandate data. We can't see individual manager data. So it's not about the Scheme Advisory Board looking into what each individual manager may or may not be charging. That's very much there for those LGPS funds to carry on doing. That's where we're at the moment. It'll be interesting to see how it goes forward when we come to look at the end of this first period to see who's put in their 2018-19, the 2019-2020 submissions, and see how that goes. The view of the Scheme Advisory Board is to wait and see. And if it turns out that there are lots of managers not complying, then it will take action. I mean, ultimately, the action it could take is to very publicly take a signatory and say, you are no longer part of the code of transparency. That would be the ultimate sanction. But let's see how that goes, because I think we're fairly confident that all the managers will actually be sending what they need. I always finish with this one, because I always do. But that's all for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jeff, Jenny and Mel. We've had a number of questions come through the chat bot. Please feel free to send more through. I'm going to try and group a couple of them and come to you one by one. First of all, I'm going to come to you, Mel, as chair of the board. But I'm going to try and summarise a couple of questions into one. What support can we expect to see from the CTI and from regulators to help encourage more managers, particularly of less mainstream asset classes, to provide data in the first instance, and B, data that reflects clients' own investments? And connected to that, what might be the future plans for some of those slightly more areas that aren't covered yet by the board, such as, you think you mentioned LDI previously, so where else might the board be headed?
Okay, thanks, Joe. I'm assuming you can hear me. I think I'm off mute. So yeah, if I take those two questions, so on the second question, some of the more esoteric asset classes, I think, as I mentioned briefly, we do have a new template under construction on the LDI mandates. That's one of the areas that we identified as the board was a quick win. That's nearly complete. We hope to launch soon. We do have a kind of ongoing pipeline of asset classes that we continue to look at. So for example, we have real estate on that list as an ongoing area, fund of funds, custody services. These are all areas that the board is tracking. And when we look at these, we consider what's the kind of effort that's required to get those templates ready, but also what impact are they going to have in terms of assets under management actually captured by those templates, and where will we have the biggest positive impact. So we are actively managing that. What we're trying to do is make sure that we're not dropping new templates all the time, but that we're managing this in a staged way, so that you can expect every few months there might be a new phasing of templates, and everyone knows what to expect. On the first question, in terms of what we're doing to encourage more managers of less mainstream asset classes to provide data, and how we're working with the regulators, we have been working both with the BVCA, who, as I said, are on the board, but also the Association of Real Estate Funds. I think a colleague from there is on the webinar, helpfully, and we've been working in that alternative space to encourage adoption and continue to do so. TPR and FCA have been very long-time supporters of the CTI and its predecessors. They again have been very supportive of us expanding the framework. For example, recently on the CMA's recommendations on fiduciary management, they've been very supportive of CTI, incorporating that into the framework. And finally, DWP, lots of support there. They do, I believe, have plans to look at trustee requirements and guidance in this areas. I think those have been slightly delayed because of other issues that DWP are contending with at the current time, but they do very much have a wish to do more in this area.
Thank you very much, Mel. Jeff, I'm going to come to you next with a group of slightly disparate questions. I think I'll start with the first one because it's a question that probably fits across the full CTI spectrum, but LGPS, I know, has had some experience with this query. Putting the CTI requirements into IMAs or into contracts with fund managers. Interested in the LGPS experience and how that might buy in across the piece. Separately, just how does the reporting period for LGPS year-end and SIP for guidance hang together at the moment? And finally, of the asset managers who've signed up to the code, question about the geographical split. I'm assuming that probably means geographical UK versus overseas. So just interested if there's some views on those three quite different questions.
Okay, I'll start with the last one, and then I'll probably come to you for the first one again because I'll have forgotten it by then. So the last one, in terms of geographical split, the vast majority would be UK based. We do have some who are US based, and in that sense, we have had conversations and have made decisions to allow for the ILPA template to be submitted where it is more appropriate for that manager given where they are and given the regulatory environment that they're in. So for example, the compliance and reporting system that we've built will accept an ILPA template in the same way it will accept a CTI template or an LGPS IA template. So the first one, in terms of the IMAs, I know that some LGPS funds and some LGPS pools now include it in the first stage, and they basically say in order to get on the shortlist, you need to say that you comply with the Code of Transparency and you are the Code of Transparency signatory. We do know this because occasionally we do get some very panicky emails from people saying, I need to get on the code by next week, because they are in the middle of going through a procurement process at that point and hadn't realised up until that point that they actually needed to do that. It's a fairly quick process, but they just need to make sure that they've got the back office facilities to be able to provide it. And now it's the middle one I've forgotten, because so you can remind me of that one.
Deadlines around reporting and SIPFA. Yeah,
deadline's an interesting one because we have a backstop deadline for the purposes of the code. And when we were out and we were doing some roadshows with a lot of the funds, they came and said, well, we've agreed a deadline with our manager, but yours is different. Does that mean, so if we'd agreed a timeline of 30 days, now you're giving them 90 days, does that mean they don't have to give it to us for 90 days? So there was a lot of confusion around the timescale for when the board was going to say this is late and what the client and the manager had already agreed. And I think what we're going to have to do now is find a way of building both of those in. If the manager and the client have agreed 30 days, then it should be 30 days. And we need to find a way within the board of getting the code of transparency to match that. So we're currently working with Bahiris to see if we can make an amendment to the system that would enable the manager and the client to change that number of days that's currently within the system. So it's currently 90 days, but we do appreciate that some have got much shorter timescales that have already been agreed to. Please, managers, send that information in that timescale, and we'll look to see if we can amend the system so it matches that.
Okay, thank you, Jeff. And Jenny, I'm going to come to you. The examples you talked to in your slides were sort of very large schemes with lots of resources. If you're a smaller scheme, does this work just as well for you?
I think actually, Joe, in many ways, it's almost more important for those smaller schemes because they simply don't have the governance budget to invest in having a CIO and an in-house investment team. And actually, the role that we as consultants can play in helping our clients to understand the gamut of costs, nobody else is going to spend the time doing this. So actually, as everybody learns from the LGPS experience and these templates start to be produced more generally, there's a huge amount that mid-size and smaller schemes can learn from this.
Okay, thank you, Jenny. So I think there's a lot more questions coming through, and I think a lot of them are going to be relevant to our next two panelists as they join us. So I'm going to introduce Chris Sear, who is at Clearglass, and Scott Foster, who's at CACEIS. I'm going to ask Chris first of all, and Scott, you're both providers of services that help gather and assess the information. I'm really interested in what's your experience, how's it working on the ground, what are you seeing, how are people using the data, kind of what's the response rate been like. Chris, I'm going to start with you, and then Scott, I'll come over to you.
Okay, something earlier was mentioned, which was credit to the LGPS for leading this initiative. I would say yes, they were leading it, but they're getting going now. There are 250 pension funds as of the 31st of December last year that have already collected their data using the CTI. So we started collecting data using what was originally the IDWG template, then became the CTI when it was formally sort of released to the market in March or May last year. And since then, we have worked with 250 pension funds. It's some 300 billion of assets under management. Size ranges down to 100 million pounds of assets under management or less. So the question about small managers was particularly relevant, all the way up to 55 billion. So RBS, which was I think in Jenny's slide, Robert's comment about getting data easily was geared around the work we did with him. So yeah, there's been a lot of adoption. Let's not dismiss the private sector as actually being currently the leaders in this space, very much so. And the managers, I think there have been some questions here about the willingness of the managers. The experience I have is that managers have been fantastic. So they recognize equally the benefits to them from giving data and allowing themselves to be compared, allowing the data they give to be standardized, and allowing themselves the opportunity to present themselves as open and transparent as much as their clients do. So we have some 550 managers we've collected data from so far. That was as of the 31st of December. Of those 550, we've collected some, I think that the total at December was some 3,500. It's about 2,000 more than that now, 3,500 portfolios of data across every asset class, including private equity. And to pick off another one of the questions earlier, the private equity private equity data comes in as much in the CTI private equity template as it does in the ILPA private equity template. Both are good. In fact, in many ways, ILPA is better because it's more granular, requires some system changes, but it's still very good. And of those 3,500, initially, as of the 1st of January in 2019, most were coming in using the old LGPS IA framework, which Jeff referred to earlier. But now almost all come in under CTI. So in total, in aggregate, across those 3,500, 48% have come in LGPS, and 52% have come in, and these are hard numbers I pulled off the system just now, 52% have come in under CTI. However, that belies the drift towards CTI. Currently, 98% of managers, 98% of those 550 are able to give us data in CTI, or if they're using private equity, CTI and or ILPA. So we have a compliance rate of, a collection rate of 98%, and all of those pretty much coming in under the CTI template, which of course we audit and check in the way that any other provider would for content, for quality, and checking the data to check it is factually correct. So it's a mass adoption, Joe. It's not just starting, it's been going for well over a year now.
Well, that's obviously great news, and good to hear such take up. Chris, Scott, I'm hoping you're living the same experience.
Yeah, well, from our perspective, we share sort of similar sentiments. As Chris just mentioned, from a CACEIS perspective, I'm a product specialist focused on cost transparency. I've been doing it full time for 3 years now, and we have 2 full-time cost transparency analysts who collect cost data from asset managers, and we collect data on around 1,700 unique funds. That represents around 225 billion worth of UK assets. In terms of asset manager relationships, it's around 202. And despite all of that complexity, we have a similar sort of success rate in collecting cost data, as Chris mentioned, and it's around 98.95% in collecting data from the asset managers. What formats do these templates come in? Well, from our side, in the past 3 years, we saw a difficulty in collecting cost data to the various cost templates. But however, now with the CTI template, we're starting to see more standardization and streamlining of submission of cost data. So in the past, we saw around 8% take up of CTI templates, and that was for 2018 and 2019 data, with the most popular template being the LGPS template to submit cost data, as well as that EMT templates, DCPT, and as Chris mentioned as well, ILPA. However, although a smaller sample size for 2020 data, we're only 4 months in, and we haven't yet kicked off March year-end cost reporting. CTI templates are already coming in at 60%, which is a lot higher than our historic rates in collecting cost data. And I think the true picture will be painted once we've completed March year-end reports, where data is expected to come in mid-May towards June.
Thanks, Scott. I've got a couple of practical questions that come through on the chat. I'm just interested in both your experiences. Chris, I'll come back to you. How is it that the data that comes through from the manager, how's that process of verification happen? How do you get comfortable that the information's right?
Yeah, well, there's a couple of important things to bear in mind. First of all, you need some experience. You can't just look at the data and tell whether it's right or not unless you've seen lots of other data. So unfortunately, it's a slightly self-fulfilling prophecy, which is you've got to have somebody who's seen lots of data to be able to assess whether the data is good. The second is a comparable data set is really important. The larger the data set, the better. If you work with a provider that doesn't have a comparable data set, you are at a disadvantage because they won't be able to tell whether the data is normalized. To give you an example, lots of different funds, for example, will buy the same pooled fund from the same manager. And so if you've got a provider that's collected data 10 times from that same pooled manager, then you will know when something is wrong if the data comes out and it's materially different for the same time period for the new client. That's one example. You also have a very finely tuned understanding of what the norms should be and where the data should go and where the spikes are possible within the CTI templates. Another useful addition to this is benchmarking. Benchmarking is not necessary. It's not absolutely necessary. It's a value add. It's a useful. We subscribe to it. Of course, we do benchmarking. But I would say that the buying of the benchmarking can be expensive in any circumstance because it's a value add service. The collecting of the data and the checking of the data is utterly commoditized and should be priced accordingly. Don't confuse benchmarking with the collection and checking of the data. you can find a provider that will both collect and check the data in that same commoditized way without having to direct you to benchmarking. But that provider needs to have a lot of historic data, needs to have a lot of other comparable data, and needs to have a lot of experience. That's the best way to do it.
Okay, thanks, Chris. Scott, I'm going to come to you again. I mean, we do have, CTI has produced top tips, which I'd recommend everybody to have a look at, and this might help with similar questions. But there's a question, if you are a trustee board and you've sort of just gone through this process for the first time, you're kind of coming out the other end. What kind of questions, how do you cope with the kind of information that comes out and the decisions that you might want to make on the back of that?
Yeah, that's a really good example, because collecting cost data, a very good question, sorry, Joe, because collecting the data is the first step. You do some validation, you do some analysis, and you make sure that the data that you've got is of high integrity for the reporting that eventually goes to a trustee board or investment committee and the like. And in our experience, we do produce at CACEIS board reports that go to trustee boards and investment committees at various DB and DC pension schemes in the country. And I would say that in the first instance, you know, time is tight in these meetings, and agendas are really long. And so you've got 30 or 40 minutes to get meaningful cost information into the heads of the trustees and the various board members that you're speaking to on costs. And a lot of our work actually at CACEIS stems from the educational work that we do with the PLSA as an educational partner. And so we find ourselves spending a lot of the time going through what is cost transparency, why are we in the room talking through these results, how did we collect the data in the first place, and then providing a high-level snapshot as to what the total cost of ownership of running the pension scheme is. So that includes all of the investment costs collected on the CTI template and all of the pension management costs associated with the administrative function of the pension scheme. And then you can start to drill down into what are my transaction costs, what are my total management fees across all mandates, all at a very high level in pounds and pence, in basis points, in percentage terms. And once that information starts to get into the minds of a pension scheme trustee board, investment committee, one snapshot is good, 1 year's worth of data is good. Where the real interesting stuff is when you start to look at trends over time. And so doing the exercise once is great, but having more and more data to compare to and identify trends over the long term is where the real value comes out of the cost analysis and reporting that goes to trustee boards and the like.
Thanks, Scott. Jenny, I'm just going to talk to you about your sort of practitioner experience and whether that's something that you can see happening too. I've got a sort of linked question about has CTI come up consultants' priority lists or out of the audit and investment subcommittee focus enough and into the main boards, and how do consultants play a part in moving that forward?
I think it's a real challenge just now. Certainly, I am finding my clients are focusing on operating day-to-day in the current environment. We know that there are certain investment issues that they've got to tackle later in the year. And so CTI is competing for time on agendas, along with a lot of other important issues. But, and here comes the actuary, we know that costs compound hugely over the lifespan of our members. And actually, if we delay taking action for a year, 2 years, 3 years, the cumulative impact on DC members' retirement outcomes and security of DB members' benefits can be material. So it is something that we do need to make sure gets onto the agenda. And even, as Scott says, starting to gather that information so that you can start to understand where you need to focus your attention is a beginning. But it's tough in the current environment.
Thank you very much, Jenny. Mel, I've got a question here that certainly we've talked about at the board quite a lot, and it was something that sort of we looked at as part of our thinking earlier in the process. Would it be appealing to have a list of asset managers who are signed up to the CTI and are using it, or is that not really necessary?
So we did look at whether there should be a register of asset managers, or even a sort of kite mark suggestion. I think as a board we decided that wasn't necessarily a helpful requirement at this stage, but that given the sort of volume of client requests we might be expecting, particularly where those are being channeled through some of the utility providers and the consultants, it would become apparent fairly quickly where there are asset managers that are consistently not meeting client demands. We obviously have a quite clear communication from the FCA as well that they want us to let them know if we're seeing asset managers that we don't think are complying with filling in the CTI templates in that area. So we haven't been collecting a list of asset manager names as such. I know that the utility providers may have a perspective on the good guys and the bad guys in this space as well.
So, thanks, Mel. Sort of associated, Jeff, any next steps for the code, or is the code pretty settled for where it is now?
I think I'll just pick up on that point, which is probably what Chris was going to jump in and say as well. I don't think the problem will be on the manager side. I can't see a problem on the manager side. I think the issue will be is on training and assistance and support for asset owners to know what to do with this data. I think where this could all fall down is managers give us loads and loads of data and then we don't do anything with it. I think that's the major danger. So on the asset owner side and consultancy side, I think it's for us to assist those trustees, or in our case elected members, to understand the data, understand what to know with the data, well, what to know what to do with the data, and then to do something meaningful with it that increases the values for those employers and members.
Yeah. Joe, can I just say something here off the back of it's a combination of what Jenny just said and what Jeff and what Mel just said. It's all three. First of all, my personal opinion is if I have to be an agenda point on a trustee meeting as to whether or not they're going to collect data, I've lost the argument. This shouldn't be complicated. It shouldn't be difficult. It should just be something that people do. They should see it as a function that they have to have. And that's either done by a provider like myself or CACEIS, or it's done by your consultant, someone like Mercer with Jenny or Hyman's or Aon, or you do it yourself, you have an employee. And Rob, obviously, from RBS has got some very good guys who've been working on this historically. It should be something that's just done automatically. It's that easy. It really is that easy. And the reason it's easy is because we have a defined standard. We don't have to think about which questions to ask anymore. The hard work has been picked up and carried by the IWG and is carried forward by the CTI. The hard work of thinking about what questions to ask has been done. Secondly, the other hard thing is getting the managers to comply. Well, I can tell you there are 550 managers that we have spoken to. Of those, only 2 have refused to give data and ultimately been reported to the FCA. So we have a success rate of asking 552 managers, and we have 550 that have given us data, albeit sometimes unwillingly, but eventually. Now that brings me on to the other point about whether or not you compile a list. Yeah, we have a list of 550 managers, but there's an inherent unfairness if I publish those 550 managers, because I've only spoken to 550 managers out of 1,850. And if I put down those 550 names, I am inadvertently championing only 1/3 of the market by simple dint of the fact that their clients are the ones who've asked me to collect data. So I'm more than willing to point out the best ones, and the best ones currently sit in the vaults of the FT. One of them is going to win the Clear Glass Transparency Trophy at the FT Awards later on in the year. But I'm not going to put all of the managers up there, because by doing so, I steer other pension funds towards those managers as compliant, when actually most of the market will probably be compliant if you ask them. They just haven't been asked yet. So it's important to bear that in mind. There's a few things there going on.
Thanks, Chris. I might just quickly, quite conscious of time, quickly come to Scott, and then I'll come back to the board members for sort of final comments. I think we saw that quote from Rob earlier at RBS. We've seen some of the other kind of feedback from Chris. Scott, is this, is this quite a simple process? If I want to do this, can I do this quite quickly and easily and get the data I want really quickly?
Yes, so I think we've made a lot of good progress in making the collection mechanism of the cost data as painless as possible. We have a standardized framework. It's quite granular, and whatever level of detail you want to go into on that cost information, you can do with the user summary template, the account level template, and the private markets template. I would just refer back to my earlier comment on education, and although the data is readily available, I would say that engagement on starting to integrate this cost data into the wider governance framework of a pension scheme, and as well as that into the investment decision-making process, the asset manager selection process of DB and DC pension schemes is a still ongoing process. And I think as more and more data comes in, there will naturally be more engagement on the work that we're doing to collect and report on this data. And I think we'll get there eventually, but I still think that there is some work to do, particularly around education and making the data meaningful to the asset owners and the trustees.
Thanks, Scott. And I think Rachel circulated the survey link earlier through the chat, so you'll probably get that afterwards as well. We are going to be using that at the CTI to try and understand how you as asset owners are using the information. But on that point of education, Mel, can you tell us a little bit more about the CTI plans?
Thanks, Joe. So I think in terms of wrapping up the board's thinking on some of this and on next steps, we have been really pleased with what we've seen, particularly from the asset managers. We are quite conscious that where there is a challenge, as others have said, is making sure that we've got trustees and asset owners fully on side. We had quite a lot of plans in the near term to run a number of conference activities around this and to have some specific engagements. I think this webinar is another stepping stone in terms of meeting our goals there, but it's very much the target for us to get out to trustees to get the message across. I think a key part of that is going to be really landing the message on value for money and the success stories. And we've heard a couple of them today, but we'll be working really actively, particularly with some of the schemes that told us they were going to be early adopters of CTI last year, to get those success stories coming through, and particularly how this does work effectively through those governance channels and the difference it's actually making on the ground in terms of the decisions that the trustees are taking.
Thanks, Mel. Jeff, I know before we turned into this sort of virtual world, you had been up and down the byways and highways of the UK talking to funds. Any comments from you?
Really, I think it's weird. As I said, it's weird at this point in time. We were supposed to be having a conversation right now about our valuations across the LGPS in England and Wales. We're looking like brilliant results with average funding levels of 98% and a deficit that's sort of disappearing. But that's sort of been lost in everything else that's going on at the moment. And really, we're just concentrating on making sure that we can get nearly 2 million pensioners paid every month. So everything else is sort of taking a little bit of a backseat at this point in time.
Okay, thank you. So I think just a couple of things I'd add. So have a look at the survey that Rachel has sent around. There's going to be some more work that we do kind of in this space, both on releasing updates from the CTI board and also some further education, guidance and other materials. And hopefully we'll be back into a position where conferences where we can meet one another in person occur, and expect to see more of us on that front. I think the other thing just to bear in mind is the regulatory interest is still very high in this topic, that it's obviously distracted by other things slightly at the moment, but we would expect to see more work from both the DWP and the regulators in order to kind of help people with uptake, whether that's nudges through guidance or slightly more formal means if needs be. But please do take the opportunity now to get familiar with things, start to use them, and get really familiar with the context. It will definitely bear fruits, as we've seen from many of the case examples that have come to us. Rachel, I think we have 3 minutes. Do we have, are we doing okay for one last comment from anybody? Okay, I will Absolutely. Open it up to I should probably come back to you, Mel, as a final comment.
Thanks, Joe. Yeah, I'm still unmuted. I think I just wanted to reflect some of the comments about the current circumstances as well. We did have quite a lengthy conversation at the last board about our CTI objectives for this year and whether they were realistic given everything that's going on in the wider markets. And I think we came to a balanced, pragmatic view that we should continue with our plans, keep them under review. But as Jenny, I think, said, there's no more important time to still be focusing relentlessly on cost transparency and driving value for money for members and employers when we are under these kind of external pressures. We appreciate there are bandwidth issues, but we think we need to stay focused on the overall CTI goals for this year.
Okay, thank you. I think we are pretty much out of time. I'd like to say thank you to everybody. There will be slides from this session. Sorry, I'm cutting across my co-host. Rachel, you know this much better than me. Please, fire away.
Absolutely fine. Thank you very much, Jenny, Mel, Jeff, Scott, and Chris for that useful information. And to you, Joe, for your excellent sharing. Many thanks to all of you watching and to those of you who asked questions.